king of German mercenaries.
Chapter 146, A Near Mississippi. After signing the documents, Marin officially began to prepare to treat the prince. First, Marin asked Ferdinand II to send someone to his residence to bring the medicine he prepared. Then, Marin asked Ferdinand II for some ginger. Ginger? Ferdinand II was a little confused. Ginger is considered a luxury spice in Europe and is used in cooking. Ferdinand II was puzzled by Marin's request for ginger. But in order to save his son, he said nothing and sent someone to the local pharmacy to search for it. Soon, a large bag of ginger was found. Then, Marin took out a knife and chopped the ginger, then took out his leather bag and took out some white sugar. "What is this?" Ferdinand II asked curiously. It's no wonder he couldn't tell. At that time, the cane sugar that Europeans ate had a lot of impurities and was very dark in color. The white sugar that Marin made was something Europeans had never seen before. Sugar, high-purity sugar, brought back by my teacher from India. Marin was used to fooling people, so he said casually. Ferdinand II had a gleam in his eyes, but it soon faded. India was Portuguese territory. In fact, Alexander VI and his son had already passed on the message that they wanted to authorize Spain to go to India in exchange for titles and fiefs for the Borgia family. But opening a route to India would definitely offend Portugal. Moreover, it was unknown how much profit there would be from opening a route to India, and whether it was worth the risk. Therefore, the Spanish royal couple was still hesitant. Marin asked someone to find a clean pot in the kitchen, put chopped ginger and sugar in it, and started to boil it over high heat. He himself returned to the prince's room. "Your Majesty, please ask everyone who is not related to you to leave first. I need to reduce your fever." To reduce the fever, all you have to do is take off the prince's clothes and apply alcohol. However, stripping the prince naked and letting so many people watch is also indecent. Therefore, in the end, only the two kings, Princess Margaret and the court doctor stayed. Ferdinand II's intention was also very simple, he wanted the court doctor to learn some medical skills secretly. With the help of Princess Margaret, Marin stripped Prince John until only his inner skin was left. Then, Marin took out a glass bottle of alcohol. A strong aroma of wine began to fill the room, and Ferdinand II sniffed, he was also a wine lover. "What kind of wine is this? Why does it smell so strong?" "This is not wine, Your Majesty. This is the essence of wine extracted from wine. However, this stuff is too strong. A sip of it will make a cow drunk. If a person drinks too much, he may die. Then why did you give it to my son? Do you want to kill him?" Ferdinand II's face changed. "Your Majesty, I took out the essence of this wine not for the prince to drink, but for external use." Marin said speechlessly, "External use?" "Yes." After saying that, Marin began to use a sponge, soaked up some alcohol, and began to wipe the surface of the prince's body. Prince John was burning hot all over, as if he had been boiled. No wonder those quack doctors wanted to bleed him. These quack doctors thought it was due to excessive blood flow. Marin began to carefully apply alcohol to Prince John's face, while Princess Margaret assisted him. As for Ferdinand II and Isabella I, they watched nervously from the side. Although Isabella I didn't particularly like Prince John, she still cared about him because he was her son. As for Ferdinand II, he treated Prince John as his own. He didn't like his daughters, but only his sons. He favored sons over daughters. After applying alcohol once, the prince's high fever subsided a lot, but it was not enough, so Marin applied it twice more. Finally, the prince's body temperature began to gradually subside, at least the high fever no longer bothered the prince. After the high fever subsided, the prince actually regained some consciousness. However, after the high fever subsided, the prince began to feel cold and kept saying it was too cold. Marin was also a little flustered. Seeing that the prince suddenly felt cold, he immediately took a towel and wiped the prince dry. Then, he took the goose-down blanket handed over by Princess Margaret and covered the shivering prince with it. Ferdinand II and Isabella I were very happy that the prince had regained consciousness. However, they were extremely worried because the prince was afraid of the cold and shivered in his bed. "Your Highness, order the servants to bring the medicine over." "Candied ginger, right." Princess Margaret hurried to the kitchen to get ginger soup. After cooling the ginger soup for a while and making it less hot, Marin began to force Prince John to drink up the bowl of ginger soup. The prince was very resistant at first and refused to drink it because ginger soup tasted bad. Marin persuaded him several times, but the prince refused to drink it. Marin got angry and yelled at the prince, "If you want to die, don't drink it. If you want to live, drink it all." The prince seemed to be subdued, and then, half forced by Marin, he drank the bowl of ginger soup. The prince seemed very uncomfortable and wanted to vomit, but Marin covered his mouth roughly and prevented him from vomiting. Ferdinand II and Isabella I were almost scared to order the guards to arrest Marin, but Ferdinand II held back because of his son's illness. "Your Highness, please send someone to get some quilts," Marin ordered, and Princess Margaret hurried to find them. "After drinking ginger soup, you need to cover yourself with a quilt and sweat. Otherwise, it will be difficult to recover from the cold." However, there was no cotton in Europe at that time, so there was no quilt. The quilt was thick, and only 3 quilts were needed to cover the body. But there were no cotton quilts in Europe at that time, and the nobles generally used goose-down quilts filled with velvet. Although this kind of quilt is light and comfortable, it is not thick enough and is somewhat breathable. So, Marin asked Princess Margaret to bring 5 goose-down quilts at once. "Baron Marin, what do you want?" Ferdinand II asked puzzledly. "Listen carefully, Your Majesty, please have all 5 velvet quilts covered for the prince, and never allow the prince to kick them off." "Ah. Bed 5? Will John get suffocated?" Ferdinand II asked worriedly. How could he get suffocated if his face wasn't covered? "Oh, it would be best if the prince wore a thick hat, but his face should still be exposed to allow air to escape, so he doesn't get suffocated." "What is your purpose for doing this?" "Let the prince sweat a lot, and when he wakes up, he will be almost fully recovered by tomorrow. What do I need to do?" "Send someone to watch over the prince day and night. Never let the prince's 5 layers of quilts slip off or let the prince stretch out his body. What we want is to make the prince sweat. Can it really cure my son?" "Of course, don't you see that the prince has woken up?" "Oh, that's right." Ferdinand II, who was usually wise and decisive, became panicked about his son's illness. At this time, our prince seemed to be very uncomfortable. He drank a large bowl of ginger soup, and it seemed that there was a fire burning in his stomach, causing his body to start to heat up. Of course, this kind of fever is different from the fever in his body. The fever in his body will make him confused. But the fever in his stomach due to ginger soup will not make the prince confused. The prince wanted to get some fresh air, but Marin forced him to cover himself with 5 layers of velvet quilts, which made him feel very stuffy. There was a fire in his chest, and the prince was covered with 5 layers of quilts. He began to sweat profusely, and sweat even started to appear on his forehead. Everyone else was worried, but Marin felt very good when he saw it. Sweating is a good thing. Sweating means that the medicinal power of the ginger soup has taken effect and has begun to penetrate the entire body. Moreover, sweating can also expel some cold viruses from the body with sweat. Let him sweat. Remember, when the prince wakes up, bring a big bucket and give him a hot bath. Also, light the fireplace. The room temperature cannot be too low. However, open a small window for ventilation. But this small window must not face the prince. Marin instructed the servants who had just come in to guard the prince's quilt. Of course, these servants did not understand Latin or German, so Princess Margaret translated for them. After that, Marin thought there was nothing to worry about, so he planned to leave. However, Ferdinand II was worried, so he ordered Marin to have a room in the governor's palace in Salamanca, not far from the prince's room. If there was anything, he could come directly to Marin. In the middle of the night, Marin was awakened by the Spanish palace guards who rushed over. Marin was shocked and thought that the prince was dead. In that case, he would be held responsible. Because the gambling agreement stated that if the prince died, he would be imprisoned for at least 5 years. Maybe, in a rage, Ferdinand II might chop him off. With trepidation, Marin followed the guards to the prince's room. When he arrived at the prince's room, Marin breathed a sigh of relief. It turned out that the prince had just woken up from his sleep, not died. Nimad, the Spanish court guard, did not understand German and only knew a few simple Latin sentences. He did not speak clearly, which scared Marin. When the prince woke up, his whole body was soaked with sweat, as if he had taken a bath. However, Prince John was in much better spirits, no longer afraid of the cold or heat, and even began to have a normal and cordial conversation with Princess Margaret, who was serving by his side. The prince felt uncomfortable at this time, because his clothes were soaked with sweat and stuck to his body, which made him feel uncomfortable. Princess Margaret didn't know what to do, so she sent the guard to find Marin. As a result, he didn't explain clearly and scared Marin. Marin naturally knew what to do. He asked someone to bring a large oak barrel and boil hot water. Then, Marin asked someone to move the oak barrel to the burning fireplace and let the prince take a bath in it. Take a bath. Baron Marin, the bishops said that taking a bath will make you sick, and you may even get the Black Death. Prince John said timidly. You did the right thing by listening to me. When you had a cold and fever before, someone even wanted to bleed you. Damn it, you were weak to begin with. If you had bled a few more times, you would have almost seen God. Marin said unhappily. Prince John thought about it and thought it was right, so he took off his clothes and jumped into the oak barrel. Marin also translated through the princess and ordered the servants to close the windows and increase the flame of the fireplace to increase the indoor temperature. Soon, the prince took a bath and changed into dry clothes. Then, Marin asked people to replace all the sheets and quilts on the bed where the prince had slept before, which were wet by the prince's sweat, with new sheets and goose-down quilts. At the same time, the small window was opened again to let in air. After all, a blazing fireplace consumes a lot of oxygen. If the doors and windows are closed too tightly, it is easy to suffocate. It is said that children in ancient Western noble families were prone to premature death. A big reason for this was that the nobles loved their children, burned the fireplace too vigorously, closed the doors and windows too tightly, and then suffocated the children to death. This time, Marin only asked for 3 goose-down quilts to keep the temperature at a certain level, but not too warm. The next morning, when the prince woke up again, he was in much better spirits. Although he was still a little weak, he was able to get out of bed and walk around. Obviously, this time, the prince was rescued. Ferdinand too was so happy that he hugged his son and kissed him and laughed, which made the prince embarrassed. After all, the prince was a 19-year-old adult. But Ferdinand too didn't care. He was obsessed with his son and loved him too much. His son almost died, and now that he has recovered, he is naturally extremely happy. In fact, Ferdinand too was a male chauvinist. He married Isabella I, who was still a princess, in order to jointly rule the kingdom of Castile. At the beginning, Isabella I took advantage of Ferdinand II's return to Barcelona for something and ascended the throne as queen, which made Ferdinand II very angry. Because, in Ferdinand II's view, even though Isabella I was the legal heir to the kingdom of Castile at the time, the king should be a man, and Isabella should be a queen. Moreover, a woman being king was considered extremely unrighteous by Ferdinand II. Therefore, for the surviving children, Ferdinand II only valued Prince John. He didn't even look at his daughters. Originally in history, when his son died, Ferdinand II almost collapsed. But after the mad woman Juana succeeded to the throne, Ferdinand II showed his extremely cold and ruthless side. In order to obtain the co-rule of the Kingdom of Castile, Ferdinand II almost sent troops to destroy his son-in-law Philip. After Philip died of illness, Ferdinand II also imprisoned his poor daughter Juana, and then took power alone. Ferdinand II almost ignored his daughter's madness and just locked her up. This was completely different from his reaction when he learned that Prince John might have lung disease. You know, when Ferdinand II learned that his son might die of lung disease, he hugged his son and cried without fear, not caring at all whether he would be infected with the fatal disease. But he was too lazy to ask about Juana, who was crazy, and let her die on her own. It can be seen that Ferdinand II favored sons over daughters to such an extent. Prince John was his beloved, and Princess Juana was just a pawn he used. Of course, the more Ferdinand II doted on Prince John, the happier Marin was. Because, since he had saved Prince John from death, Ferdinand II would definitely reward him handsomely. Chapter 147, The Savage Count and the Spice Banquet. Ferdinand II held his gradually recovering son in his arms, crying and laughing for a long time before he remembered Marin, who was waiting anxiously beside him. Ahem, Baron Marin, I will keep my promise. By the way, I want to ask, what do you want the colony on the savage continent for? Farming. Marin said innocently. Farming? Ferdinand II almost couldn't catch his breath. Isabella I, who had been doing nothing for a long time, also laughed out loud. Yes, your majesty, you know, my fiefdom only has a few small islands. The land is barren and lacks fresh water. It is not suitable for farming. Marin blinked and continued to play dumb. So you're going to the savage continent to farm? Aren't you afraid of being hacked to death by those barbarians? It's nothing. I can choose a small island or a river estuary where there are few barbarians nearby, reclaim tens of thousands of ugrams of arable land, and grow a lot of food. As he spoke, Marin showed an intoxicated expression. Ferdinand II and Isabella I both felt a chill, and even Prince John beside them shivered, thinking he was afraid of the cold again. Didn't you get authorization from the Pope to buy spices in India? That business is very profitable, why do you still want to farm? Ferdinand II knew that Marin had bought the authorization to buy spices in India. Your Majesty, you know that I am just a small baron. I was impulsive before, but now I have calmed down and thought that I am just a baron. If I compete with the Portuguese for food, wouldn't that be courting death? I sent out 4 ships to explore the route this time, and the Portuguese also sent 4 ships. Of course, they couldn't do anything to me. However, once the route to India is determined, the Portuguese will see the huge profits and will definitely not allow my ships to participate next time. Maybe next time the Portuguese will send a fleet to intercept several of my ships. By then, I won't be able to continue doing this business. Marin lamented, but what he said made a lot of sense. The most distinguished couple in Spain nodded and agreed with Marin. After all, Marin, a small barony, could not compete with the Kingdom of Portugal. So you're going to the savage continent to farm? Prince John asked curiously. Yes, I will try to cultivate 100,000 ugrams of arable land in the savage continent and become a big landlord. Ha ha ha. Everyone was amused by Marin's words. Then, after obtaining his wife's consent, the delighted Ferdinand II signed a document allowing Marin to open 5 colonies in the savage continent, America. Of course, in order to stop others from talking about him, Ferdinand II decided to confer the title of Count of the Wilderness on Marin, who was subservient to Spain. In this way, Ferdinand II not only repaid Marin for saving his son, but also ensured that the wilderness continent still belonged to Spain in name, achieving the best of both worlds. But, Your Majesty, I live in the northernmost part of Germany and am a count in Spain. I cannot come to the Iberian Peninsula to pay tribute to Your Majesty. You don't need to pay tribute. I'll confer you the title of Count of Aragon and Castile to shut others up. I'll make it known in the documents. Although you're conferred the title of Count of the Wilderness, you have all the rights in these 5 colonies and don't need to pay taxes to the kingdom. It's enough for you to belong to Spain in name. When your descendants succeed to the throne, they don't need to be conferred the title again by the royal family. They can just hold their own coronation ceremony. Thank you very much, Your Majesty. Don't worry, I'll send someone to find a Bible. Please swear allegiance to us first. You still need to swear allegiance to my wife and me during the first canonization. Okay. Marin knelt on one knee without hesitation, put his hand on the Bible, and swore allegiance to Ferdinand II and Isabella I. Anyway, it's just a show. Besides, there are huge benefits after the show is over. How big do you plan to expand each colony? Ferdinand confirmed again. Don't worry, Your Majesty. I will only draw a circle on the map with the port as the center. Marin replied. However, Marin did not say that it was a world map with a scale of 130 million. Drawing a small circle on it would be at least 100,000 square kilometers, much larger than Portugal. Okay, I believe you. Come, write this sentence into the document. Ferdinand II was very pleased with himself, thinking that he had restricted Marin. Little did he know that the small circle he wanted was much larger than Portugal. The 5 small circles added together were definitely much larger than the Spanish mainland. After both parties signed the document, they both thought they had gotten an advantage and laughed. Marin naturally knew that he had gotten a great advantage, so he laughed brightly. Ferdinand too thought that he had repaid the debt of saving his son's life with 5 small pieces of uncultivated land, which was a great deal, so he smiled happily. After the simple allegiance ceremony, Ferdinand II and Isabella I returned to the capital Toledo with the prince and his wife and Marin. In the royal palace of Toledo, Ferdinand II and his wife entertained Marin warmly, and Prince John, whose illness had greatly improved, also accompanied them. Although Prince John was born to the cunning Ferdinand II and the equally ruthless Isabella I, he grew up in the palace and had never seen the cruelty of the world. Therefore, he was still a little confused and a little shy. When Marin reminded him to be moderate in sex, the prince blushed. However, Marin was so depressed about the dishes at this palace banquet that he wanted to die. Marin never imagined that Ferdinand II would prepare so much pepper for this banquet. During the entire banquet, Ferdinand II probably took out dozens of pounds of pepper. That is, there were not many people present. If there were more people, Ferdinand II would probably take out hundreds of pounds of pepper. You have to know that in medieval Europe, the price of pepper was extremely high, so high that ordinary people could not afford it at all. In the early Middle Ages, the price of pepper was extremely high, reaching the point where 1 pepper bean was exchanged for 1 gold coin. Of course, that was during the Crusades when Europe and the Middle East were at war. The price was so high because it was out of stock. At this time, the Venetians could still find ways to buy pepper, Turkey had not yet controlled Egypt, and the European land trade routes had not been cut off. Therefore, the price of pepper at this time was only about 10 shillings per pound. In India, the origin of pepper, the price of a pound of pepper is at most 1 or 2 pfennigs or pennies. 10 shillings equals 120 pence, so the profit of Dagama buying spices in India is as high as 60 times. Now, due to the scarcity of pepper, spices such as pepper, cloves and cinnamon have become privileged items that only the nobility can enjoy. Generally speaking, if you are a noble nowadays and you don't prepare a lot of pepper, cloves, cinnamon, etc. when you hold a banquet, you would be embarrassed to call yourself a noble. For example, when the King of Scotland visited King Richard I of England in 1194, Richard I made the King of Scotland eat 2 pounds of pepper every day to show his hospitality. How could he not get angry? At this moment, Marin encountered such an embarrassing situation. Ferdinand II served a lot of pepper to entertain Marin. The roast meat should be dipped in pepper, and so should the bread and cheese. Seeing the king and his wife and the prince eating bread or roasted meat with pepper with relish, Marin felt a chill in his heart. In fact, Marin was not very fond of spicy spices like pepper. It was okay to put a little bit in the food, but Marin couldn't stand it if there was too much. What's more, if you eat bread or barbecue directly with pepper like the perverts at the banquet. So, in order to save face for the king and his wife, Marin just dipped it in a little pepper and ate it with gritted teeth. Unexpectedly, this caused misunderstandings among the king and his wife. This child, after all, comes from a poor small family. He is not used to delicious pepper. Alas! Ferdinand II and Elizabeth I discussed in a low voice. Elizabeth I also nodded repeatedly, expressing her deep agreement, and then looked at Marin with some contempt for the country folk, but also a little sympathy. This child, who usually doesn't have pepper to eat, how miserable his life must be. In fact, the reason why the European nobles of that era spent money like water was that a large part of it was spent on buying spices. Often, a nobleman would consume hundreds of pounds of expensive spices such as pepper, cloves, and cinnamon when hosting a banquet. These spices are not cheap, so often after a banquet, the cost of spices alone would be hundreds or even thousands of gold coins. Therefore, those nobles who like to hold banquets are in poor financial conditions, but most of them grit their teeth to show off. If anyone holds a banquet and does not put a table full of spices for guests to dip in, they will be embarrassed. As for what to do if they are out of money, take a loan. Hanseatic merchants like to lend money to these nobles, charging an extremely high interest rate of 15%, or in exchange for commercial privileges. After a pepper banquet, Marin felt that he was about to get angry. So he asked the maid for a lot of honey and drank honey water to reduce the heat. Although Marin dipped in a small amount of pepper during this meal, he still felt a little numb in his throat and his taste was almost destroyed. He really couldn't understand why the European nobles of this era had such a heavy taste. In fact, many nobles were almost bankrupt in order to buy spices. Fortunately, Marin does not have such a hobby. Otherwise, he would also go bankrupt. Moreover, what makes Marin laugh and cry is that since Marin cured the prince with ginger syrup, Ferdinand II and Elizabeth I have begun to upgrade ginger, a mid-range spice that they used to not think highly of, to one of the main condiments of daily food in the Spanish court. Marin agrees with this. Eating more ginger is indeed good for health. Of course, eating too much is not good either, and it also depends on the season. In order to escape the pepper banquet prepared by the happy Ferdinand II and his wife, Marin used the excuse that he had something to do in the territory. After eating several pepper court banquets that made his mouth blister, he hurriedly fled the Toledo palace with the appointment documents of the Count of the Wilderness signed by the royal couple and began to rush back. However, before leaving, Marin was worried that Prince Juan would die young in the future. So, as a half-baked Chinese medicine practitioner, he held Prince Juan's hand and taught him a secret of health preservation: eat radishes in winter and ginger in summer, and you don't need a doctor's prescription. In fact, Marin saw this sentence on a health program in his previous life, and used it to warn the weak prince. At the same time, Marin repeatedly told the prince to eat less food that is easy to get angry, such as ginger and pepper, in winter, but he could eat some in summer. In addition, he also told Prince Juan to exercise more to stay healthy and to moderate his sexual life. In fact, Marin had no good intentions. He was just worried that the powerful Charles V would appear in the future, leaving him, a small prince who wanted to be king, with no way to go. He was not really good to the prince. But in the eyes of the prince and his wife and Ferdinand II and his wife, Marin was really good for the prince. So, they looked at Marin in a different light. Marin's seemingly casual reminder really played a big role. Prince Juan, although it can also be translated as Prince John, but Prince Juan is more Spanish, listened to Marin's reminder, paid attention to health preservation, and really lived a long life. Of course, this is a later story,